Hello, and welcome to the April RunJumpDev monthly meeting. This month we're happy to have Nina Freeman on video. We'll get to her in just a moment. Wanted to let you know, coming up, if you're watching this right now, this Saturday there's a cool event over at Eastern Kentucky University called Burn the Keyboard. If you're into alternative game interfaces, game hardware, Jerry Belich, who created the Choosatron and a number of other projects, alt control projects, will be guiding this workshop where you get some hands-on experience creating new controller stuff. Go check that out. We've got information at our website, runjumpdev.org, or you can check out EKU's Gaming Institute account on Twitter. And then, of course, at the end of the month, let's see, that would be about a week and a half from now, we have the Vector Game Developers Conference, also hosted over at EKU. And if you are anywhere in the Midwest, South Midwest region, we'd love to have you. We'll have it's a single-day game conference, and we'd love to have you out. There's more information at vectorconf.com, or again, you can go to runjumpdev.org. We've got everything there. So we're very happy to have Nina Freeman this month. She is the author of the games How Do You Do It and Cibele, both released in the past year or two. And she's currently working for Fullbright, who brought us Gone Home. She's working on Tacoma as a designer there. She's done a lot of cool stuff, and we're very happy to have her this month. And Nina, I'll turn it over to you if you want to tell us a little bit more.
Sure. Hello. Yeah, so my name is Nina Freeman. As mentioned, I'm a level designer at Fullbright. I started working there on Tacoma last February, I think. Yeah, basically I finished grad school and then moved to Portland from New York City and immediately started working for them, so that was intense. But yeah, I make games, primarily doing designing and writerly stuff, also coding and other things. I guess I've gravitated a little away from that over the last year or so, but I also do that. And my focus is on character-driven story games and also vignette games. So a vignette being a sort of a character study or an exploration of a specific moment. And yeah, so narrative's my focus. The two games that I worked on that were mentioned, How Do You Do It and Cibele. How Do You Do It came out a couple years ago now. It was a game that I made with some friends at a global game jam, actually, with Emmett Butler, Deki Koss, and Joni Kataka. And that game is a game about a little girl who is basically at home alone while her mom goes out to the store. The little girl's like, 10-ish years old, and she's alone. She has her Barbie dolls, and she wants to know what sex is. So she uses her Barbie dolls to do that. And so she basically, in the game, you play as this little girl banging her dolls together, trying to sort of like simulate what you think sex is. And then in the end of the game, it says you might have done sex X number of times based on like how you played. So that was one thing. And then Cibele, which is a game I worked on as a designer and writer that came out last November, is a game about a girl who meets a guy on this online game, kind of like a World of Warcraft, and they have a relationship, and it's about how they meet up to have sex. And you play as the girl in the relationship and embody her and sort of see this scenario from her perspective. So that, I guess, is like sort of a quick summary of the stuff that I do.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we've got some questions to ask you, and also
Yes.
If you are watching the stream live, you can tweet at the RunJumpDev Twitter account, and we'll pick up questions there if you want to interject. And of course, if we have anyone in the room who's interested in asking a question, just hop up to the mic and we'll get you set up for the next one. Cool. Well, first one we wanted to start out with was a question: how do you plan out narrative in terms of like physical spaces? How do you construct a level informed by narrative?
So I guess I can't talk in too much specificity about Tacoma because we're working on that and etc. But as far as Cibele goes, which in a different way had a lot of level design in it, I'm getting more used working on Tacoma. It's a first-person 3D exploration game. So in that game, when I'm working on level design stuff, it's a lot of like spatial design, like what does it feel like to navigate through this 3D environment, and what does it mean to be in this part of the environment versus that. what part of the story is being told here or there, what's the pacing like, etc. So that's one thing. And in a game like Cibele, which is a game, if people haven't played it, basically it takes place in first person as if you're this girl sitting at her desktop. So you have full control over her mouse, kind of as if your hand is her hand, and you can like click through her desktop and open her files and explore all her pictures and blog posts or whatever she has saved on her computer, and also log into her online game to play with Blake, this guy that she's dating, and that you, the player, you're embodying her as she does all this, so you do all that as well. So in that game, the level design was basically like designing the computer, because basically Nina's computer, Nina the character, is the space within which you play the game. So the way that I approached the level design in Cibele was very much like, what are the folder hierarchies and what things are on the desktop during which level, and what does that mean? What does that actually tell the player about the story and about the characters? So even though it's a 2D game, it is actually like technically a first-person game, which is like, I guess, kind of weird because we're used to thinking about first-person games in 3D. But I guess I kind of set that up in the beginning of Cibele, contextualizing all this by showing a short film in the very beginning of the girl sitting at her computer and then cutting to first person to her desktop. So it's like you see the girl that you're about to play as, and then you cut to her desktop, and now you can play on her computer because you're embodying her. So with that as the context, the level design was like, okay, what moment is it in the story? In Act 1, the moment is kind of like, oh, they're flirting, and they haven't really like talked about sex yet, but they're kind of like in that flirty phase where they're trying to figure out how to communicate with each other. So when I was thinking about what to populate the computer with, at that point, I was like, okay, I need to give the player a little context about what their relationship has been like up to this point, because the vignette is really only focused on one moment in their relationship and not the whole thing. So how can I, as a level designer, populate the level with the stuff that expresses that to the player? So, for example, one of the things I did was there's like email exchanges with her and her friends and IMs that sort of refer to what she said about her relationship to them, you know, outside of the game or in class or whatever. So her friend will email her and be like, oh, like, are you playing that game with that guy again tonight? Haha, like, you should come to this party instead. And that communicates to the player, oh, you know, the player character has this life outside of the game, but she's clearly coming back to it because of this guy, as her friend implies. So that says something about what their relationship has been up to this point. So for a game like Cibele, the level design is like, how can I put little pieces of ephemera that are basically breadcrumbs that lead the player to a better understanding of the character and the story? And the tools I had were the stuff on the desktop, the stuff in her email, the IMs she gets from her friends in the game. So that, I guess, is sort of a quick rundown of how the level design in Cibele was approached for me.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially where you're trying to portray that experience of sitting at a computer a lot.
Yep.
So how do you first start out? Like maybe with Cibele, did you start out with like a paper prototype or some kind of like hard copy, or do you launch straight into like your tools, or how do you get started?
So Cibele actually started as a prototype, a digital prototype that I made during grad school. I was in this class. I went to grad school at New York University, and I was in this integrated digital media program, which isn't technically a games program, but I was able to take classes at the NYU Game Center, which is a really cool program. And one of the professors there is Bennett Foddy, and he was running a class called Prototype Studio, where basically everyone in the class would make a prototype a week for the whole semester, and each week would have a different theme. So it was basically a game jam a week, so that's pretty intense. And one of the weeks was sex. That was the theme. So that week I was kind of like, okay, my friends and I made How Do You Do It Before, which is a game that's about sex, and that is about like how I was thinking about sex as a really young child. It's like sort of based on a true story around my life. I draw a lot of these stories from my own life. And so given that I had already done this like childhood sexuality based game, I wanted to like think about what that would what kind of story I could find from my own life at a slightly older age. So I thought to my teenage years, which is full of stuff, obviously, because teens think about sex a lot. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, oh, there was that one time I met up with a guy and had sex with him after knowing him from an online game. And that was a story that had always been interesting to me, and that I would like tell my friends and they would find it compelling. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll take that story and see if I can explore it through this prototype for class. And then I basically threw together in a week a prototype of what later became the Vaultimary segment of the game. So when you're playing the fake MMO, basically, the prototype was that made in Flash using Flixel. And also myself and Emmett, who actually did end up playing the body of Ichi in the real game, doing some like bad voice acting for the prototype. Like I wrote like sort of a tiny scene about how they were like playing the online game together, and he was like going to give her something nice in the game, and she was like, oh, you don't need to do that, or whatever. It was really stupid. But it started as that digital prototype, and then I decided to run with it and pursue that prototype as part of my master's thesis project, and gathered a bunch of friends to work on it with me. But it did start out as sort of that tiny solo week-long digital prototype.
Cool. So what's your methodology for writing? When you're approaching game design or narrative design, how do you do it?
So I guess to a certain extent it depends on the game, but generally I start out, when I'm thinking about making a game, I almost always start out with a story. So for example, like with Cibele, my first step was to say, okay, you know, I had this how do you do it game, and I really like that. Like, what story can I draw from my teenage years to riff on for this game? So I usually start in that way, and then when I have the story, conceptually, like I haven't written anything down at that point. I just like have sort of a nugget of a story that I will draw on, and then I'm like, okay, how can I use mechanics to contextualize and support the story, and how can I help the player embody the character in this story using game mechanics? My focus is really on player character embodiment, so the mechanics are always sort of designed with a story as a base and mechanics that help you perform that story. So I actually don't usually start writing stuff down until I have a good idea of how the embodiment is going to be expressed in the game. So for Cibele, I had the nugget of the idea, and then I sort of made the decision to have it be like you're sitting as her at the desk, clicking around and fighting stuff like you would in an MMO. Once I had that idea down and like semi-prototyped, I started writing a script with dialogue. So the actual like nitty-gritty writing stuff usually comes like a little after the initial idea and maybe a little prototyping, and is basically there to flesh out this nugget that I'm using to create the mechanics.
So what do you like about computer desktop as a presentation, as an affordance for a player? I know I've seen a few other games doing that now. Emily is away. There's one today that came out. I think it was something like Not a Lost Phone or Another Lost Phone, designed to be played on a phone. It looks like you're using somebody's phone.
Cool.
What do you like about it? What attracts you to that setup?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. For Cibele, it made sense because like that is the way I experienced it. Like the best way to bring the players close to that experience was to basically sit them in that chair and say, okay, here you go. This is what it was like with the headphones and hearing someone talk to you, like through Ventrilo or whatever. So for Cibele specifically, that was sort of the way to bring the player closest to that lived experience. And you know, also there's another game I worked on called Freshman Year that I wrote and designed, and in that game the mechanics are based on texting, so you basically interact with the game through this like little phone interface that kind of looks like an iPhone. So I guess I've like come back to this like tech interface as mechanic design sensibility like quite a few times, and for me, I mean, I think that's just because that's been such a core part of my life for seemingly ever. I mean, I think my mom got us our first computer when I was like 10, so I can barely remember a time where I wasn't sitting on a computer messing around. And I think that given that this kind of technology is part of everyday experience, and I am highly interested in telling stories about ordinary life people, that technology is going to come out in a lot of those stories because it is just such a part of our everyday lives now and a part of my everyday life. So I think more than anything, it just comes out of my desire to tell ordinary life stories, and technology being so involved with that.
Yeah, as being a real common denominator.
Mm-hmm.
We all end up, especially if you're already playing a video game, you're probably not unaccustomed to sitting there and being
yeah, and that's actually, yeah, it's actually good to take advantage of some of the assumptions that people have about how computers work. Like for Cibele, you know, we didn't want to actually like rip off a literal OS, you know, visual design, like a desktop design, just because of copyright or whatever. So I was talking to the artist Rebecca, and I was like, basically make it look like a Mac interface, because people are really used to that, but like draw your own original art for it, but just like make it look like that, because then we like, you know, don't have to do as much tutorialization of those elements, because people already know how to use them pretty much. Even if they're more Windows users, like you still can kind of get a sense, oh, there's like a panel in the lower left corner, like I probably should click on that. That's something that is pretty natural to most people who are going to be playing Cibele, since it is a computer game.
Let me see. So do you have any suggestions for reference material, things like books or articles or websites on subjects related to game design, things you like or go to?
Yeah. I actually wrote down a bunch. I'm going to pull it up quickly. I have like a bunch because, like I mentioned before, I like did this whole master's thesis, and obviously I had like to do a ton of research for that and have all these sources. My master's thesis was about player character embodiment using Cibele as like a test case, as a way to experiment with my ideas around that. So I have like all these like sources. I tried to pick the ones that would be the most useful to most people. One of the books that when I was like starting making games, is one of the books that I was really excited about, which was Rise of the Video Game Zinesters by Anthropy. I imagine I think a lot of people know about this book because it's like so good. But I think everyone should read it, especially if they're just starting out or like need to feel inspired. It's just like, it's super good. It's actually one of the first books that I read that actually referred to Vignette games, for example. There are portions of her book where she talks about that, and where she talks about games as a way to help players perform identities that are very different from their own. So that book is like packed with really interesting ideas around that kind of stuff. So I think that's a good one. Also, another one I actually used a lot for my thesis specifically was Rules of Play by Katie Sale and Eric Zimmerman. And that one was really interesting because, you know, I started making games without having really any background in it. Like, I came from the poetry world, and I'd been playing games for a long time, but I didn't have any, like, formal knowledge of it or whatever. And arguably, you don't need it, but I find it useful. So when I read Rules of Play, that was like sort of my way of being like, okay, these people definitely really know what they're talking about, so I'm gonna like take in their ideas and see if I can like apply them to what I'm learning as a game designer. So I use that book a lot for reference, and there's a lot of really good concepts in there, especially for people who are doing narrative design and player character embodiment design. I think that is a good book to look at for reference for that stuff. And I guess while I'm talking about like narrative stuff, vignettes, which I kind of keep referring to Vignette games. Yeah. There's very few articles that I found that are about Vignette games exclusively. They're definitely there, but there's not super a lot. And one of the first ones I came across was this Game of Sutra article by Ian Bogost called Persuasive Games Video Game Vignette. And that article is really good. It's like a morsel. It's not a super long read, and it refers to a bunch of really interesting Vignette games and sort of explores what makes them vignettes. So that's a really good reference if you want to just like learn more about what vignette games are and can be. I actually think maybe my definition is even a little more flexible than the one in that article, but regardless.
What is your definition?
Oh, for me, I think I am just specifically thinking of often, I forget if the article says this or not, so maybe I'm totally wrong, but often people talk about vignette games, like they will talk to me about it and be like, oh, like how do you do it? It's obviously a vignette game because it takes 30 seconds to play. And I'm like, it is a vignette game, but not because of the amount of time it takes to play. It's because of the way the story is told, and that the story is specifically focused on this one brief moment, and it really digs deep into that one specific scenario. So for me, vignettes are not restricted by time. You could have a vignette that lasts hours. Really, the constraint is, are you focusing on one thing, like one character, one aspect of a character, one scenario? So I think anything from how do you do it, or the beginner's guide, or the Last of Us DLC with that stars Ellie. There are a lot more games that I consider vignettes because I don't really constrain it to a time-based thing. I think vignettes can be any length of time as long as they have the constraints of a vignette.
What's your opinion on Passage?
Passage?
Yeah.
I don't think I've actually played Passage, to be honest. I do know of it, but I haven't played it, so I couldn't say. Sorry.
Well, it covers a lifetime, but it also kind of gives you a very narrow window into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if it's exploring one aspect of it really specifically, then that probably is a vignette.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that a vignette translates into a larger project? Like, are there big vignette games? I guess you mentioned The Last of Us DLC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I consider Cibele to be a pretty big game as far as games go. I mean, it takes a couple hours. So I guess everyone's definition of how big a game is very different. But that said, Cibele is definitely a vignette game. But I even look at, for example, Final Fantasy X. You play that game. Obviously, the whole game is not a vignette, but it is composed of many vignettes. Actually, I'm going to use 10.2 as an example because I played it more recently, but same thing. In 10.2, you know, there are a lot of different like missions and scenes and all these different sort of discrete parts that make up the whole game, and often there will be, you know, like there's a silly scene where you're playing as Yuna and you go into LeBlanc's mansion and you like give her a massage, and that's got its whole own mini game. That's like a little vignette game of that moment for them. Or in Final Fantasy X, when you're playing as Titus and you're in Kilika, which has recently been like destroyed by the main antagonist, Sin, and there's a kid sort of in this hut, and the hut's falling apart. If you go up and try to interact with the kid basically almost gets trapped in this hut, and you save him or her. I'm not sure if it's a girl or guy. And so you save the kid, and then the kid's like, thanks, and like runs away, but you can follow that kid all the way back to their sister and then have like a little scene with them. So that's like a weird little vignette within Final Fantasy X of like you rescuing this kid and then like meeting their family. So I often am looking for vignettes within these games like a Final Fantasy, or even I've been playing a lot of The Witcher, and there's a lot of vignettes in The Witcher, the new one. So I think vignettes are hiding all over the place, and whether they're the full game or a part of the game, they're definitely like in a lot of them.
So are there mini games that wouldn't qualify as vignettes, do you think? Is it a tie to a narrative thing? Like Mario Party, for example. Yeah,
I wouldn't even refer to vignette games as mini games. I think they're different. I think the vignette is really focused on the narrative aspect, where it's diving into like a character study or a moment or something where there is a narrative constraint that says there is a larger story that could be told here, but we are going to focus on this one part of it and dig really deep into that. That's what I would recognize as a vignette, mm-hmm. as opposed to like a racing game that has many small rounds, for example.
Yeah. So, do you remember, was there a particular game or gaming experience that first made you think it was something that you could do for a living, making games?
hmm yeah, I guess for me, I started thinking about making games. It was after I graduated undergrad. This wasn't even that long ago. It was like 3 or 4 years ago. And I was in New York City, and I kind of, through these concerts that I was going to, fell into this crowd of people who were making games. And I met Diego Garcia and Emmett Butler, who I've worked with both of them later. But I met them, and they were working on a game called Heads Up Hot Dogs together at the time. And I was like going and hanging out with them when they were working on it. And I was like working on my own stuff, but I'd sort of like watch over their shoulder, like, what are you doing? It was like an iPhone game, so they were in Xcode and like, doing their thing. Test flight and all this stuff, and I was kind of like absorbing all that information, being like, oh, weird, like these people are actually making a game and it works on their iPhone and they're gonna like sell it. I'd played lots of games, but I'd never really thought about how they were made until I actually saw it happening. And then they and this like New York game scene introduced me to, like, for example, Gone Home, Kentucky Route Zero, and Dysphoria, and Cart Life. So when those games were coming out, that's when I started playing games made by smaller teams that weren't games that I was necessarily going to find at a GameStop or whatever. And when I discovered those, I was like, okay, now I know people can make games. I see it happening. And these games, like the four I just mentioned, are narrative driven, which I find really interesting as someone who is a writer. And in poetry, I was exploring this narrative stuff with vignettes, and I was kind of like, oh, here's Dysphoria, for example, a game that I would consider a vignette. That's interesting. Maybe I could make a game that's a vignette too. So that, I guess, is the short version of how I like started in the games that kind of got me into it.
Cool. You also worked as a web developer for a little while, right?
Yes.
How would you contrast, like so you've worked kind of both sides, maybe business and entertainment. How would you contrast the two? Like for somebody who is maybe in the business side or the business development, who's looking at games as another career path or another endeavor, what's your take?
Yeah, actually, for me, the reason I was doing web development was basically because I wanted to make games and wanted to teach myself how to program, and it was way easier to get web development internships than it was to get game development internships for me, because I just didn't know anyone, but I knew a lot of people in the startup world, and got into this program called Hack NY, which is a New York program that places students with local businesses to work as an intern, a programming intern for a summer. So I was with Kickstarter when I did that, and then worked for Kickstarter for a little bit as a web developer after that. And I worked for a little at this place called Craft Coffee as a web developer, interning, etc. And all of that really was to just like build up my skill set as a programmer so that I could support myself and be learning how to make games, because for me, I wanted to like write the code for all my games, so I like needed to learn how to do that. So for me, it was that was like a very specific reason to be going about that kind of career path. But that said, like, I think that, being a web developer can help you transition into games, as can being like a poetry person like I was. Like, there are all sorts of different ways you can come into it, because there are so many different things that make up games that you can learn how to do and then contribute to something. So I guess for me, I'm like, it doesn't, like, from any background, you can probably find a way to apply that background to game development, because games are like so interdisciplinary, as I have learned. So my web development skills helped me as a game developer, as did my poetry skills, as did other stuff that I've done. So it all kind of coalesces nicely.
Life.
Yeah, life.
Do you have any other advice for people who are trying to get started in the industry, or maybe missteps, things to avoid, or things that really make sense? Or
yeah. So I guess my advice would be a couple things. First, obviously it's different for everyone. So for me, I specifically, when I was getting started, I really needed to just like make stuff immediately. Otherwise, I would just like never do it. I would just keep thinking about it and not actually make anything. And I think it's really easy to get stuck like coming up with all these cool ideas for games and then like never executing on them. So I knew that I would get lost in that rut really easily. So I immediately started going to tons of game jams. Like I was like going to multiple game jams a month when I got started. Maybe not that many, but a lot. So I was basically going to game jams and releasing the games immediately onto the internet. So I tried to build up my portfolio really fast, but I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of a portfolio. I was just like, I want to learn how to make games, and this is the best way for me is to just make lots of stuff and like figure out what part of this process is the most fun for me, which ended up being like the writing and design. But that's why I like dabbled in code and all the other stuff, because I wanted to see how it worked from all different angles and just ship something. So I think, and I've seen for people starting out, taking that strategy seems to work pretty well, because making games is really hard and it just takes a lot of practice. And so the more you ship, the more practice you'll have and the better you'll be at making games. So I think that's always a good strategy, especially as someone who was totally self-taught at first. Like I wasn't in school for this. I was doing it after work. Like I worked at the Department of Education as a data analyst, and I was like after work, like going to game jams all the time. So self-taught at first and then did grad school later. And yeah, I think that's probably the best way to go about it. And if you can afford school, going to school is really helpful as well. It gives you space and time to make more stuff, which is always really helpful. But if you don't have that, you know, try to make time for yourself when you can and go to game jams if you can. That at least was the stuff that worked best for me. And make friends while doing it and work with them and try and like form teams at these game jams and like keep in touch with those people. Because at least for me, making games is entirely collaborative. I very rarely work alone. And it's good to just have people that will support you and work with you and that you can learn how to work well with, because that can also be a challenge.
Do you ever have problems with motivation, or are you a fan of commitment devices of any kind, like public promises or food rewards? Like
yeah. I actually like, I don't know, I have like release fever where I feel like I need to be releasing something all the time, even though like I totally don't. So that's like a weird issue that I have where I'm always like, if I haven't released something in a couple of months, like, oh no, that's bad. So that's probably not the best approach. I don't know when I developed that or why, but I have. But I guess in the broadest sense, I'm just excited about storytelling, and I'm excited about, you know, making games that have a certain level of polish. Like that's something that I'm really committed to. So I guess I just keep doing that, and I like will make small prototypes when I can, and then like I have a bunch that are just sitting on my computer of ideas that I have that I want to build out, for example. So I always just have something lying around on the side, and I feel like always having something to look forward to helps me move forward, whether that's a milestone or a prototype that I've got lying on the side, or like lots of milestones. I definitely always set milestones for myself and deadlines, especially internal ones that I don't tell anyone. Public ones help too, but the internal ones I do more frequently. So I guess deadlines and always looking forward to the next thing motivate me.
Cool. So I was poking around a little bit, and it looks like you're also working on a game, Bum Rush.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. So Bum Rush is, so basically, long story short, last year I got commissioned by No Quarter, which is being organized by Robert Yang. Everyone should play Robert Yang's games. Robert's amazing. Robert commissioned me to be a part of this, myself and 3 other game designers, and we each made games for this event, which is basically a party that takes place once a year in New York City, and each designer makes a game to present or to show at that party. There's no presentations. It's just sort of like set up at the party for people to play. And I've been going to No Quarter for a bunch of years myself, and it's where I first played Killer Queen and Speed Chess and all these like very large local multiplayer games that I really, really like. So I was super honored to get that commission. That was super crazy. And the game I made for it is called Bum Rush. And Bum Rush is an 8-player car combat dating sim racing game where you play as one of 8 college roommates who each have a hot date on the same night, and they can't agree who will get to use the room to have sex with their date that night, so they race for it. So it's basically a sex-iling racing game with the catch that it's kind of like bumper cars. So as you're racing around the neighborhood trying to go on your date and get home, you can bump into other people's cars and knock their dates onto the sidewalk and then like collect them up. So you can bring home as many dates as you want, bring them on all these dates, go home with 5 people if you want, and whoever gets home first with at least 1 date or more wins.
So was that for No Quarter last year or this year?
Last year.
Last year, cool.
So technically it's like pretty much done, but we haven't released it. For the event, like I knew there would be a ton of people around to play all night, so I really focused on the like 7+ players maps. And now I'm like trying to make some maps for 2 to 4 players just because most people at home don't have 8 controllers to use or a USB hub to support that. So I'm trying to make some like lower player maps and then we're going to release it.
You got to get them sharing the controller, 1 stick per person.
Yeah, that's true.
Up to 8. So we are taking questions on Twitter. If you want to tweet at RunJumpDev. And do we have anyone in the room who wants to ask questions?
Hi, everyone. I'm way over here on the other side of the screen, but hi. I can see you.
Over yet? Go for it. Yeah, hop up.
Sorry, I'm so washed out, by the way. I'm like sitting in front of a window, so the light is kind of intense. I feel like I look like a ghost.
I've always been like really impressed with how like deeply personal that some of your stories are and how much detail you're willing to share. And I was wondering, like, have you ever felt like nervous sharing that with everyone, or do you feel completely comfortable going into all these details?
Yeah. So I guess for me, when I was doing poetry before I started making games, I was reading work by, Elizabeth Bishop, Langston Hughes, Frank O'Hara, all these poets who have a lot of personal writing, who draw from their own lives in their writing quite frequently. So, for example, one of the poems that inspired How Do You Do It is called In the Waiting Room by Elizabeth Bishop, and it's about a time when she was a child and she was with her aunt at the doctor's office, and she was waiting for her aunt while she was in her appointment, and little young Elizabeth Bishop, like 12 or something, picks up a National Geographic and sees a topless woman, like a grown woman, for the first time. So she sees breasts, like mature breasts, and she's never seen that before as a child. And the poem is about how that makes her feel, or how that made her feel as a kid, and what her reaction to that was. And so that's the kind of work that I was coming from. So actually, it's funny, like, I get asked a lot, like, how I can talk about personal stuff when I make games, but, like, that's just how I learned to write when I was doing poetry, because that's what a lot of people were doing there. And I guess it is seemingly not as common in games, or at least not as talked about, or I think people are often drawing from their personal lives, but they don't say that they are necessarily. So for me, it's not something that makes me nervous because I have a lot of practice doing it. I did it a lot in poetry. Almost all of my work there was also very personal. But I also don't think of it as personal myself. I think of it as like based on a true story, and I often take true stuff and sort of like shape it to fit into a narrative that I want to say or something like that. So it's not as literal as like a diary for me, like I don't think I would share my actual diary or anything with the world, but telling these stories, which I craft, is like a totally different thing for me. So I definitely look at these personal stories as almost as fiction rather than nonfiction autobiographical stuff, at least in my writing process. So yeah, for me, I look at it in those terms.
And I heard mentioned somewhere that you might have had like kind of a conservative upbringing. how's your parents' kind of reaction to your work?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I guess my parents have played a couple of my games. They haven't really played any of them. They definitely haven't played Cibele. I think my mom, when she saw How Do You Do It, she was like, that's weird. Like, she didn't react very well. But they totally support my work and stuff. They just don't. They're like, it's not for us, and I'm like, that's fine. Like, these games aren't for everyone. It's okay. So no like major strife or anything. But definitely some people that find some of the stuff I do questionable. But that's fine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Hello.
Hi. I have a question from Twitter. I would
Cool.
pronounce this name, but Twitter, I'm not really good at pronouncing names. So, what aspects should you focus on when designing a co-op vignette game?
A co-op vignette game.
That is the question.
I guess Bum Rush is technically, well, I guess it's not actually co-op, it's competitive. Have I ever done a co-op vignette game? I mean, I think that regardless, basically, if you want to make a co-op vignette game, make sure that the story that you're telling through that game has constraints and that you don't go beyond those constraints. So, for example, in Cibele, it's about the relationship between these two people, and that relationship exceeds the scope of the vignette that Cibele is expressing. So Nina and Blake had a relationship that started at some point and that developed for many months before the events of the game occurred, and that relationship went on after the events of the game. But the game, since it's a vignette game, focused on that one specific part of the relationship, and it did provide enough information about the other parts of their relationship in order to help the player understand, you know, what's going on, just have enough context. So I think, you know, I can't give advice on your specific co-op game unless I know what the mechanics are, but for the story, make sure that you're focusing on that one specific slice of the larger thing that you're looking at.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
So one of the themes that's throughout a lot of the games that you're working on personally is sex and sexuality. What's your feeling on where sex and games intersect? Like, what do you want to see?
I feel about how sex is depicted in games right now, basically, right?
Yeah. What are you looking for? What's your what do you want from games?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because I think there is actually a lot of sex and sexuality in games right now, and there has been. It's just that it hasn't been talked about as openly until now. So that's cool that people are more interested in looking at sex and sexuality in games and taking it seriously and having discussions about it. So that's a good development. And I want to see more conversations around games that are about sex or that have sexual material, etc. And I'm specifically excited about games that explore sex sort of on an individual level, so sex from the perspective of ordinary lives, which is definitely part of Cibele. You know, it's a story about two ordinary people, like basically ordinary 19, 20-year-olds, and how their experience of sex is, and it's a very unique experience and very specific to those individuals, which is why I spent a lot of time fleshing out the characters and going to a lot of effort to not make it seem like some kind of universal statement, because I don't think there is any universal experience of sex or sexuality. It all comes down to the individual. So more stories that really hone in on individuality and the sexuality of real human stories. I think that's important to me. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways you can approach these topics in games, but that's what I'm most excited about.
Have you played any games recently that have been kind of like good examples of what you're looking for and where you want more game designers to explore? I feel like I should have a good answer to this. Oh,
Well, I don't know, it's always something. I've been getting really into otome games, which are basically Japanese visual novels that are targeted at women, and more often than not straight women. It's usually about a girl choosing to date one of an array of guys. And I've been playing this one called Hakuoki that's about this girl and these 6 or 7 samurai during feudal Japan, or the feudal Japan era. And it has an amazing story. It's so good. It's like seriously now one of my like top 10 favorite games ever. It's amazing. I think everyone should play it. There's no like sex scenes in it or anything, but it's all about romance and love and flirting, and I actually think that the writing of flirting in that game is really strong, which I don't see super often in games, so that's a good one. And also, I've been playing a lot of Fire Emblem Birthright, and I feel like their whole mechanic of like putting characters next to each other and having the relationship grow based on that is really clever. So I like seeing those little touches in games when they have that kind of stuff. So those are 2 that I've been thinking about that I've been playing recently. And yeah, Hakuoki, by the way, is spelled Hakuoki. I'm tweeting about it like literally constantly. So.
Well, I was going to ask you.
I'll be tweeting it out.
Cool. Anyone else here who is interested in asking a question? Yes.
Do it.
I have another question.
Go for it.
Besides yourself, of course, are there any like designers that are doing interesting things in narrative games that we should be looking out for?
Mm-hmm. One game that I played recently that a friend of mine made that I like think everyone should play because I think it's amazing is Jenny Zhao Shaw made a game. Oh God, what was it called? I should look it up really quick. But it is a game, I posted it, about putting on your makeup in the morning. I don't know if any of you saw this. Do you know what it's called?
Morning Makeup Madness.
Morning Makeup Madness. Okay, yeah. So it's like a free Unity web browser game, and basically you have like 30 seconds to put all your makeup on, and then you get a score based on that, where it's like, oh, you're like on fleek or whatever, or like, oh, maybe not so good. And it's hilarious, and it's like this perfect little vignette game just about putting your makeup on in the morning, and it's like kind of like silly, but the mechanics are just so good. I don't know. That's a really good game. So I think, and looking at Jenny's work, she's just like awesome. So she's definitely someone I would recommend. I am trying to think. Oh, it's always hard to like think of people on the spot for some reason. If I think of anyone else, I'll mention it. But we should keep going because otherwise I'll just sit here and think all day.
Yeah, I love that makeup game because I've actually been trying to make a makeup game for a while.
Oh, cool.
And, like trying to get it to be fun was difficult, and then I played that game and I was like, oh, she did it way better than I could have, and then I should abandon that endeavor. Actually.
Oh, still make your game. It's worth it.
Thank you.
So I've got one other question that I think we got a submission. What was your favorite retro or classic game, and have you ever tried to bring that gameplay into other games you've worked on?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. It's hard for me. I guess it depends on like what your definition of retro is, and my definition is like, I don't even know what retro is to me, because honestly, like my first console technically was a Sega Genesis, but like it was just given to me by a friend, like I think way after it came out. And like I never actually played any Super Nintendo games or arcade games, and games that I think usually people talk about as retro. Like I just didn't have any of that stuff growing up. I really started playing games a lot when I got the N64 kind of, but mostly the PS1. So those are like the old games I think of from like my childhood. Stuff like Spyro or Crash Bandicoot or Ocarina of Time. Like those are the first games that I played on console, at least. On computer, I think back to like Myst and The Sims. and SimCity. Those are like the first sort of computer games I played. So I think, you know, those games probably have had an impact on me subconsciously because they're like the earliest games I played, or like the scholastic educational games I would play at the mall when I was like 5, or Neopets was how I first learned how to code, was because I was like making stupid websites and stuff on Neopets. So those are like, in the broad sense, the early games I played, and I kind of think of them as retro in my own head because I played them so long ago. But as I've gotten older, this is just, it hasn't had any influence on me as a designer, I don't think, but Bar Arcade opened up near where I live in Portland recently, called Quarter World, and they have a Tapper machine, and Tapper is like my favorite arcade game ever. You play as a bartender, and it's basically just a score chasing game with 4 levels that loop, and in each of them you're just trying to serve beers to all the customers, and you lose if a customer gets to the end of the bar without a drink, or if a drink falls off the bar. So it's just this chaotic game about serving beers, and it's so good. So maybe that's my favorite retro game, but I didn't actually start playing it like until I was over 21 because I found it in a bar.
Do you want to?
Hi. I had a question regarding when you started getting into doing jamming a lot. Kind of what's your, if you don't mind elaborating a little bit on what your approach is to kind of like learning through jams in particular. I know a lot of people, like even experienced designers, can have like a different approach. I personally think about tacos until the theme is announced, but a lot of the people feel like they might go through like and think, I want to make this kind of game. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are.
Sure. So, I mean, when I first, like, I forget what was my first game jam. I think my first game jam was like a PlayStation Mobile jam. I don't know. It was like super hard. So I remember my first game jam, I was pretty demoralized because it was so hard, and I didn't know how to code at all, but I was still trying to. And basically, after I got that first bad experience out of the way, it was all uphill from there because I was like, nothing could get worse than how hard that was. So having the one bad experience motivated me to like always have better ones and to just like treat them all as a learning experience rather than feeling like I had to like ship something perfect by the end of it. I was like, I have something playable at the end. I did it. That's all I want. It doesn't even have to look that great or feel that great. It just has to be a thing that I finished in some capacity. So one, I learned how to have a pretty flexible definition of finished. Definitely have released buggy, bad jam games before, but I put them out anyways because I was like, I made this, like, whatever, I'm going to put it out into the world and see what people think of it, because that helps me be a better designer. If I put the game out there and let people play it and listen to what they have to say about it, I can learn about design by doing that. So I developed that flexible definition of finished. And I definitely went to game jams with the same people frequently and worked on very similar teams. So like, how do you do it was with the Emmett, Decky, and Joni, and the 4 of us worked on a bunch more game jams after that, and Emmett and Decky actually worked on Cibele with me. So I kind of kept working with these same friends because I felt like I had a good working relationship with them where we worked very well together and we knew each other's rhythms pretty well, I think. So that definitely helped me because, you know, learning how to work with someone for the first time is definitely like something you have to figure out. It takes time. And using technology that I'm most familiar with, I actually tried, like, at first I had to learn new technologies because I knew none, but I basically picked up Flash and just kept using it because it's really hard to learn a new technology at a jam, but if you use them to learn one, that's a good way to do it, and that's how I did it. Because it can be pretty demoralizing to be like just doing tutorials for half the jam every time you go if you're using a different tool every time, and it's better if you're just building on your skills each time. For me, at least, that made me feel better. So using tools that I'm familiar with, working with people that I've worked with before, and developing relationships by going to lots of jams with them, and having a flexible definition of finish so that I can release something at the end of every jam.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
So do you have kind of Is there a game idea for you that's like a desert island game idea that is something that you've wanted to work on? It preoccupies you, and there's something holding you back, but like it's something you really want to push on.
Yeah, I guess. Well, lately I'm so focused on Tacoma that I barely think about other stuff. There's one game idea I've been kicking around that is. I don't want to say too much about it though, because I don't want to spoil it. But it's kind of inspired by Emily's Away. So something inspired by that I might work on if I have a few free hours here and there. But I guess longer term stuff, I definitely have a bunch of stories in my head that I've always thought were really interesting that I like to tell my friends over drinks, kind of like the Cibele story, where that was one that I had told people before, like over drinks or at dinner, just being like, oh, here's this crazy story I can share with you right now, like for entertainment, basically. So I have a bunch more stories like that that I have kind of been kicking around in my head for a long time, mostly around either various relationships I've had, almost all failed ones, and also stories drawn from my mom's life, because my mom had a pretty interesting childhood and youth. She grew up in Melrose, Massachusetts, and I kind of like the idea of setting a game in more of an urban setting, not urban, but like between suburban and urban. So like Melrose is pretty close to Boston, but like kind of outside of it, and I'm interested in a game set in that space about someone who grew up there. So yeah, I guess those are some of the things I've been kicking around. I actually have done some informal interviews with my mom trying to like figure out something that I could, you know, use for material for a game. So I have some notes from conversations with her that I am cultivating slowly over time.
I try to do the same thing. Like when I think of questions to ask my parents when I visit, like try to keep a notepad full of them.
Yeah, parents are full of stories.
Is there a game that you want someone to make? Maybe it's not you for one reason or another, but you want to exist.
Yeah, I guess I say this because I have watched the new Rihanna music video earlier, but I would love to see, like, so I was really obsessed with the Kim Kardashian game and still really love it, and I would be really psyched to see more, especially like women pop stars making games. Like I've watched all these Rihanna music videos, and a lot of them have really interesting depictions of violence, and I'd be really interested to see how she would work with a designer or just herself translate that into a game. So I would love to see more, you know, pop stars making games, basically.
There was a game a couple of years ago from Cactus. Let's see.
You're not going to get the name.
I am. No, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it. I'm totally going to get it. It's because I was just looking at it the other day. Werewolf keyboard fucking drum set.
That's a good name for a game.
It's basically a game music video for this band, for a song from a band called.
They're called, I think, the same thing. I think the name of the band and the name of the song.
Yeah, it's something like Werewolf fucking drum set, I think is the name of the band. But it's all over the place. But it's, nice. I guess, an example of a smaller collaboration with a small band and a developer.
Yeah, actually, my friend London O'Connor released a really awesome album last year, and one of the songs on the album came out with a game. So if people are interested in that kind of thing, it was pretty cool. And also, Sean Hogan's been apparently. I read about this on Killstream the other day, but Sean Hogan is someone who I'm friends with. He worked on Anodyne and is making Even the Ocean with Joni Kataka, who I've also worked with. And Sean is a really great composer and actually did some sound stuff for Cibele. And he has been working on an album that is a game. It's like inseparable, basically. Like the album and the game are the same thing. And Onomataguchi actually did that recently too. Their game Capsule something is really good, and everyone should go download it. It's so good.
Cool.
Capsule Silence, yeah, that's it.
Well, do you have any other Twitter questions or anything? Well, I think we're out of stuff. Is there anything you want to know about us?
You guys are out in Kentucky at a school?
We are. Currently, yeah, we're at the the campus of the Bluegrass Community and Technical College, who is gracious enough to host a number of our events, including the Global Game Jam that we put on, the real world gathering for that every year.
That's sweet.
A whole bunch of people out. Yeah.
So it's like a mix of students and non-students, basically, the group?
Yeah, so our group, RunJumpDev, is more community focused. We have some students, but a lot of just general community members. We've got a mix of people from small studios down to, hobbyists and just people who are interested in it, or people who work in related things, 3D modeling or audio writing, stuff like that.
That's cool.
So, yeah, it's a community to try and organize it, show that it's happening here, and make connections, put people in touch with other people who know stuff about it.
Yeah, that sounds actually very. There's one like that. There's a group like that in Portland called Pig Squad, and they do really cool events. And it sounds like your group does similar stuff. So I love their events. So yours must be really good too.
Yeah, we've kind of been ramping up for a few years. This year is going to be our biggest, with a whole bunch of big events going on.
Sweet.
Yeah, and there's also in Louisville. There's Louisville Makes Games, which is. They started a little bit later than us, but they've been rocketing forward and just opened their own co-working space called Warp Zone. They've been spinning up pretty quickly.
Cool.
So it's been fun to see the groups emerge.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Just about every city seems to have some kind of presence.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much. Where can we find you? Where can we find more about you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is really fun. And yeah, to find my stuff, my website, which has like how do you do it and a bunch of other free Flash games that I worked on that you can just pull up in a web browser. That is ninasays.so. So that's NINASAYS.SO. And there's a link to Cibele there, but the Cibele site, if you want to buy Cibele, is cibelegame.com. That's CIBELE game.com. And my Twitter handle is HentaiPhD, which is HENTAIPHD. So I guess that's all my stuff. And Tacoma, my third website, is Tacoma-game.com, and Tacoma is spelled TACOMA, and there's a really cool trailer there. You should all check it out.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, thank you. It was nice meeting all of you digitally.
And you can stick around for just a moment. Cool. So this has been our April monthly meeting with Nina Freeman. And again, we've got a couple events coming up. We've got the Burn the Keyboard Alt Control thing this Saturday. Please find out more information about that at runjumpdev.org or at our Twitter account, RunJumpDev. And at the end of the month, week and a half to go, is our first annual Vector conference, game developer conference, hosted down at EKU. Especially if you're a student, we'd love to see you. If you're doing games work in the area, we'd love to see you. Please come out to that. You can find more information at vectorconf.com. And thanks so much.